Good day to you. Welcome to The-Shree-Channel. I'm Nitin Dalvi. Today in our Heroes Amongst Us series, I have the pleasure of introducing Vijay Balakrishnan, who has written a fascinating book about a little-known chapter of Indian history under the name of Vijay Balan. Vijay is a rocket scientist turned storyteller, surely a unique combination. He worked on the space shuttle and has held senior positions in fintech companies. But he never lost sight of his passion for Indian history and the English language. The Swaraj Spy, published by HarperCollins, is the result. Vijay, tell us what the book is about and the arc of the story, if you will.
Thank you, Nitin, and thank you, The-Shree-Channel, for having me. I think you're being altogether too kind, calling me a hero. I'm not a hero, but there is a hero in all of this, and it's the protagonist of the book. And I'll get to that in a second, but let me first of all tell you about the person I'm talking to. Nitin worked for the Coca Cola Corporation for 33 years in leadership roles in many parts of the world, in Southeast Asia and Africa, and also here at the corporate headquarters in Atlanta. But he was also part of the team. He led the marketing of the team that reintroduced Coca Cola into India. So if you are sipping a Coke in India as you watch this or later, Nitin had a lot to do with that. So anyway, so let me move on to the story arc that you asked me about, Nitin. So let me set the historical context. You know, the popular narrative in World War II is that the British, the Americans, and the Russians were the good guys, and the Germans, the Japanese, and the Italians were the bad guys. But from the point of view of the colonized people, like the Indians who were suffering under British colonialism, the British weren't necessarily good guys. So an army was created with Japanese help to defeat the British and therefore gain independence for India. And that was called the Indian National Army. Now, many of you may know about the INA, but if I were to ask you to name the first leader of the INA, my guess is most of you will say Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, and you'd be wrong. Because the first leader was a man called Mohan Singh. There was an INA before the one we know about, and that one collapsed because of intrigues between the Japanese and the Indians. The reason I'm telling you is that history is often cluttered, and I get into a lot of this in my book. So, my book, The Swaraj Spy, is about my granduncle, my dad's mama, who was an officer in a British paramilitary outfit, and he refused to follow an order to disperse a group of women protesting for Indian independence. So they threw him out of the force. He went back to Calicut, his hometown, tried his hands in business, failed. His mother thought he would settle down if he got married, confirmed bachelor, but his mother said, you see this girl, if you say yes, fine. If you say no, I'll never ask you again. So he took one look at Malu. She swept him off his feet. He got married, but he's still struggling with trying to make sense of his life. So he goes to Singapore to earn a living. Unfortunately, World War II intervenes and the Japanese come very quickly down the Malayan Peninsula and take Singapore. Now, while he was in Singapore, he met the people who later on formed the INA, and they convinced him to join a secret spy school in Penang, which was called the Indian Swaraj Institute, and therefore one of the reasons for the title of my book. He was both a cadet and an instructor in the school. Now, I told you about the intrigues between the Japanese and the Indians, but there was also a double agent there who was telling the British what was going on. So when a group of cadets was sent to India by the Japanese without the knowledge of the Indians and possibly got captured because of this double agent, my granduncle was sent on a rescue mission, but with two very different instructions. The Japanese told him to go identify the surviving agents and continue the mission. The Indians, the INA, told him to identify the surviving agents and hide till the end of the war because they didn't trust the Japanese. So this book is about all the twists and turns of what happened to him and how he transformed as a person. But it is also about his wife, who waited for him back in India, not knowing where her husband was, alive or dead, and she did it in a very stoic, very unique manner. So that's really the broad outline of my book.
So Vijay, tell us, what was your inspiration for this book? Tell us how it came about.
Well, when I was a little boy, my father used to tell me stories about this man because to my father, his uncle was a hero. So I had little bits and pieces of the story floating around in my head all throughout my life. So one day I had an epiphany saying, boy, this is a story that must be told. And that kind of got me started on a long journey to do the research and write the book. So the inspiration was basically planted in my mind very, very early in my life.
So Vijay, you mentioned that the book is, you've given the inspiration. It seems to be very well researched. How did you gather all the information that you have woven into this book?
Well, I mentioned that epiphany that I had, which got me started on the book. And I said, okay, let me find out about this man and the Indian Swaraj Institute. And I went on the web and I looked and there was nothing. So that launched me on a 6.5-year journey with a lot of travel from the US to India to try and stitch this thing together. And it was really like putting together an old jigsaw puzzle where many pieces were missing. So I started out with family and I was able to gather a lot of information, including letters that he had written which had been preserved all these years.
Interesting.
So that allowed me to get into his head.
Right.
Because the book, in addition to being about the history and the intrigue, and also it's really a book about transformation, how this man changed from a kind of a gung-ho officer who would take that hill and 3 hills behind it to kind of a reflective soul thinking about the human condition. So that's where I started. And then through networking, one person introduced me to another, to another, to another. I was able to get my hands on British era documents about this whole episode. And it was amazing how much the British knew because they had double agents.
Right.
It was fascinating.
Right.
And I tend to be a visual writer. I think I consider it my duty to take you as the reader there to see, hear, smell, what my characters are going through. So I visited several of the places mentioned in the book. But it's interesting, if you go to modern day Singapore, it's all steel and glass. It doesn't look like what it used to look like. So I spent hours and hours and hours, probably days on YouTube looking at old videos of wartime Singapore. What does an air raid sound like? What did it look like? And so on. And Burma was too dangerous for me to travel. So, and Burma has not changed much since the wartime years. So, because I knew where this man had gone, I was able to sit in my study here and use Google Earth to go and look at all these places that he went to. So in the end, the story that emerged out of the mist, if that's the right word, was way more fascinating than the little bits and pieces that my father had told me.
Vijay, you told me a little bit about your background. So tell me, how does an aerospace guy from the University of Illinois and a Wharton MBA end up writing what, if I may say so, a pretty evocative book? Where did those skills come from?
Well, thanks, Nitin, for your kind words. So I grew up in Ooty in southern India. That's where I went to school. And during my school years, I had 2 sets of interests. I liked physics and math, and I also liked language and history. And the physics and math took me through the career to the career that you had mentioned. But the history and language I owe to some teachers I had. So the principal of our school was a Canadian gentleman. His name was Mr. Fox. We used to call him Foxy. So the way he used to teach history, we were all in 5th standard. So he was teaching us a class on Shivaji actually. So imagine a portly man with a big red beard, and those days they used to actually wear capes, the old English public school model. So he would pace up and down the class, and he would say, Aurangzeb was looking for Shivaji, and Shivaji would come and sting him like a bee, and he would turn around and go this way, and then he'd sting. 5th standard kids, we were in splits. We were, rolling with laughter. We thoroughly enjoyed that lesson. And he also made us draw comic books about various aspects of history, even though comic books were banned in school. He allowed us to write those, draw these 2x4 or 3x3 comic books. Those lessons are in my mind to this day. So he planted the history bug in me. And another teacher, his name was Mr. Xavier, encouraged me to do public speaking and writing and so on. So really, that's where all of this comes from.
It's amazing what a good history teacher can do in terms of bringing history to life.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So Vijay, amongst other things, the book has been endorsed by many people, amongst others by Shashi Tharoor, the famous author. So please share the endorsement with us and talk to us about the marketing of this book. I understand that you have been globe-trotting, sharing this with audiences worldwide. So talk about that.
Thank you, Nitin. So yes, Dr. Tharoor was kind enough to endorse the book, and I'll just read his endorsement, which is on the back cover. He says, "The Swaraj Spy is an engrossing story that delves into a place and time that writers and historians have unjustly overlooked for a long time. Vijay Balan guides the reader through fascinating landscapes, high political drama, and the inner transformations that the savagery of war can provoke. A compelling work of historical fiction based on the author's granduncle's life, well worth reading." So I'm grateful for those very kind words. In terms of marketing the book, Nitin, I've got a great publisher, HarperCollins, and they helped launch the book, but a lot of it beyond the initial launch phase is really up to the author. And you have to be, if there are aspiring writers out there, it doesn't end when you get published. In fact, a whole new journey starts. So you've got to keep yourself available for all kinds of promo events. I did quite a bit of promotion in India. I've done 3 literature festivals so far, and I'm on my way in another few weeks to the 4th one. I did a literature festival in Calicut, another one in Nagpur, one in Trivandrum, and I'm going to be doing one in Mysore. I also did book signings in Mumbai, Pune, Bangalore, Chennai, and Delhi, about 27 bookstores where you actually go sign the books. And I've done several launch events as well. So it's been a learning experience because while I've done the kind of things that you talked about in my professional career, this whole business of going out and promoting a book has been new, and it's been a lot of fun.
Talk a little bit about some of the literary festivals. What kind of people attend? What is the audience like?
It's quite an eclectic group, and each literary festival has its own formula, so to speak. The one in Calicut was open to the general public over 3 days. 500,000 people attended this festival.
Wow.
And
That's
most
amazing.
of them were young, and they asked amazing questions. So I came back very optimistic about Indian youth. The one in Nagpur was focused on nonfiction, so it is a very different crowd, kind of an erudite crowd, who asked some very, very incisive questions. So each one of these is different. It's also a great place to network and meet other authors, many of them much further ahead on this journey than I am at this point.
You had told me a humorous incident about the Pune launch. Can you talk a little bit about that, where the roadside bookseller?
So yeah, that's a great story. So I visited a bookseller, the Solanki bookseller in the Kant area in Pune. So I was driving around looking for a store, and it turned out that this man was actually selling books off the sidewalk. He would set up the store every morning, and he'd take it down every evening. But he sold more books than many of the chains.
Amazing.
So I was sitting there on the roadside. They brought out a little carton for me to sit on, and I was signing books with traffic going by, and it was an amazing.
Surely a unique book signing, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So Vijay, let's get into the history behind the book a bit. After all, the INA was crushed. What do you think is its relevance to today's India, especially amongst the younger cohort that may not be aware of all this?
That's a great question, Nitin. I must tell you something about Nitin. He is also a passionate history buff, particularly about Indian and Egyptian history, and I'm not surprised this question is coming from him. So the Japanese came very quickly down the Malayan Peninsula and pushed the British out from Malaya and out of Burma in 1942. And had the Japanese followed and gone into India in 1942, there was nothing between them and Calcutta. But the Japanese didn't do that. They stopped because they had to fight the Americans because Pearl Harbor had happened.
Oh, right.
And so on. And by the time they finally attacked India in 1944 and fought the battles of Kohima and Imphal, it was too late. But the Indian National Army was something that, in my opinion, the Japanese did not use properly. They should have looked at the Indian National Army, the INA, like the Indians used the Mukti Bahini in Bangladesh.
Right.
A force that knew the landscape, knew the opposing force, and would have been able to turn many of those troops that were fighting the Japanese against them. But having said that, in 1944, the British came and crushed the Japanese and the INA. They then captured all of the INA prisoners, but they took 3 of them as kind of marquee prisoners and put them through trials in the Red Fort. They are called the Red Fort trials. Shahnawaz, Sehgal, and Dhillon, a Hindu, a Muslim, and a Sikh. And what the British wanted to do was to make these people an example, saying, we're going to try you for treason and possibly execute you, because here's a lesson, you will never rise up again. But what happened was the entire country had been kind of made ready for this by the 20-some years of civil disobedience under Gandhiji. So this news of 3 people being tried, and by the way, the British made it an open trial to teach the Indians a lesson. The entire country rose up. And the British knew that this is not something they'd be able to pull off. And so they acquitted those people. In 1946, the next year, the Royal Indian Navy revolted. 46 ships, 10,000 soldiers revolted.
Right.
Air Force units revolted. Right. So the British realized that they couldn't hold India with the Indian armed forces anymore. So I often tell people the INA failed tactically, but they succeeded strategically, right, in that the goal of delivering independence for India was actually achieved because they made the British lose trust in the Indian armed forces. Right. In fact, Clement Attlee, who was the Prime Minister when India became independent, when he visited India in 1956, he is supposed to, this is hearsay, he is supposed to have told the governor of Bengal, Mr. Chakraborty, that one of the reasons that the British left India was because they couldn't rely on the Indian armed forces, as they did earlier in history during the 1857 uprising. They brought the Madras Army and the Bombay Army to put down the Bengal Army. Right. They couldn't do that anymore. Right. So they knew their time was up. So unfortunately, Netaji was not alive to see that. But the INA, in my opinion, eventually succeeded, although they were crushed.
Right. It's interesting. The pioneers always get the arrows.
The pioneers are the ones in the arrows. Correct. Exactly.
And for those of you who visit Red Fort, there's actually a very nice memorial to all the people who participated, including the cell where the INA 3 members were tried. So a really fascinating part of history.
Right, and it's in the fort that's adjoining the Red Fort. It's called the Salimgarh Fort. It's a fascinating museum. I highly recommend you go see it.
Vijay, could you tease us a bit by reading a little bit of your book?
Certainly. So let me set this up. This is when the protagonist of the book, my granduncle Kumar, is evacuating his sister and her children helping them evacuate Singapore in the middle of a bombing raid.
This is when the Japanese have already come in.
The Japanese are yet to actually come in, but they were bombing Singapore.
I see.
Right? So the sister's name is Tangam, and the two children are Sulu and Suku. And Kumar is there with his brother-in-law who goes by AM, by the initials AM, and another brother-in-law called Gopal. Okay. As they neared the harbor, cars and vans jostled horse carts and rickshaws laden with people carrying large bundles. Drivers leaned heavily on their horns as if the sound could part the traffic. A huge throng pushed and elbowed its way from a sea of abandoned vehicles to the docks. The Keppel docks in Singapore, a source of British pride, had controlled the commerce between the Far East and the Indian Ocean. But the round-the-clock bombing had reduced hubris to rubble. Roofless warehouses now gaped at the sky. A dockside crane lay sprawled on its side, its legs twisted in grotesque angles like a giant squashed insect. The funnels of a sunken steamer rose out of the water like pillars supporting the dark clouds of smoldering ash that asphyxiated everyone's lungs. Kumar AM and Gopal linked arms to form a protective ring around Tangam and the children. They tried hard to keep their balance. They meleeed through the little band about like driftwood washed ashore. They reached a gate beyond which armed soldiers allowed only passengers to pass. Policemen desperately tried to control the crowd. Kumar steered the group to Royal Navy officers checking boarding permits. A swarm of hands waving pieces of paper besieged the four harried officers. Checking permits against identification was impossible. The officers looked quickly at permits and yelled instructions to the gate sentries about the number of passengers. 2, 4, 3. AM let Kumar's hands go to get the papers from Tangam. He thrust the sweat-soaked permits at the sub-lieutenant. A torn epaulette bearing his rank insignia dangled from his shoulder. The officer looked absently at the permit, jerked his head at a guard and yelled, 3. AM stuffed the papers back in Tangam's hands as she moved forward with the children. The soldier glanced at the papers and grunted, Ship 4, there. He pointed at a ship anchored 100 yards away. The ship's name had been hastily painted over in black. There was no time for goodbyes. Tangam met AM's gaze and smiled for a brief second. The crowd swallowed her and the children as it surged towards the ship like a tidal wave of heads. Kumar, AM and Gopal tried to see the travelers board the ship, but the police quickly shooed them away. The crowd pulled in different directions towards two ships. Tangam kept her eye on her ship's funnel and dragged the children with all her strength towards the vessel. Her carefully pulled tight bun came loose and wavy hair twisted crazily about her shoulders. Sulu used the suitcase in her hand as an instrument to push people away. She ignored hurled curses and helped her mother as much as she could. They were halfway to the ship when the air raid sirens went off. The crowd surged forward as one mass, jammed together with no room to take cover. Bombers appeared above the harbor in two giant V's. Anti-aircraft guns let out deafening bangs. A shudder ran through the crowd at first as frightened screams rang from all directions. After a few shells, they ignored the guns and pushed relentlessly towards the ships. The bombs fell like hail. Tangam prayed that their ship would not be struck. Oil storage tanks at one end of the harbor exploded into flames. A few bombs fell on warehouses, but they spared steamer number 4 and its dock. The stench of burning petrol descended like a toxic cloud. Sulu coughed and tried to raise her free arm to protect her face. The crush pinned the arm to her side like epoxy. She thought she saw the word city off, faintly visible under the black paint smeared over the ship's name. Tangam willed herself to push through to the gangway that was only yards away. It's close now. Stay close. Come on. A little Chinese girl just a few feet from Tangam suddenly lost her grip on her mother's hand. She quickly disappeared into the crowd. The panic-stricken mother screamed for help. Tangam caught the woman's haunted eyes. There was nothing she could do to help. The horde carried Tangam and the children away from the unfortunate woman. She thrust her boarding papers at an officer at the foot of the gangway. He waved her on without looking at the permits.
Wonderfully evocative, Vijay. You bring that whole scenario of chaos and humidity and sweat and the bombers to life. Well done.
Thank you so much.
So Vijay, you've taken us through a fascinating chapter and a little known chapter of Indian history that I'm sure many people would like to know more about. How can we get the book?
Well, thank you for that question. First of all, thank you so much, TheShreeChannel, for this opportunity to share my work with you. To get the book, if you're in India, it is available on Amazon India, and also it is available on Amazon US. But the best suggestion I can give you is go to the website theswarajspy.com, and that site has got reviews, videos, but it's also got links to Amazon and to the various places where you can get the book, depending on where you are in the world. So thanks once again for this opportunity, and thank you, Nitin, for taking your time to have this conversation with me.
Thanks, Vijay, and congratulations. Is there going to be a sequel coming along?
Well, not to this book. I don't think there'll be a sequel, but I do want to write more books, and it will be in this genre of little known history, and most likely Indian history.
So, in conclusion, what happens to the protagonist? What happens to his wife? Please stay tuned, buy the book, and read the book.
Exactly.
Thank you, TheShreeChannel, and please like and subscribe to the TheShreeChannel.